Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her leather messenger bag against her chest, feeling the weight of 3 years of sleepless nights, countless sacrifices, and her family's unwavering faith pressing down on her shoulders. The morning air cut through her thin jacket like a knife as she stood at the transit stop, watching her breath form small clouds in front of her face. Today wasn't just another day. Today was the day that would determine whether all those years of struggle, all those moments when she'd chosen textbooks over social gatherings, study sessions over sleep, would finally pay off. Her final examination in corporate law waited for her across the city, and with it, the gateway to everything she'd dreamed of since she was a little girl watching courtroom dramas with her father. The scholarship that had carried her through university, the one her working-class parents had celebrated with tears of joy, had one final requirement. Pass this exam with distinction, and doors would open. Fail, and she'd have to watch her dreams slip through her fingers like sand. The public transport vehicle rumbled to a stop, its doors hissing open with a mechanical sigh that seemed to mirror Sarah's own nervous exhale. She climbed aboard, scanning for a seat near the back where she could review her notes one last time without distraction. The vehicle was surprisingly empty for a weekday morning, just a handful of early commuters lost in their own worlds, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of their devices. Sarah found a seat by the window and immediately pulled out her carefully organized study materials, her eyes scanning the pages filled with legal precedents, case studies, and definitions she'd memorized until they'd become part of her very DNA. Constitutional law, contract disputes, intellectual property rights. The words blurred together as the vehicle lurched forward, beginning its journey through the awakening city. She was so absorbed in her review that she barely noticed when an elderly woman boarded at the next stop, moving with the cautious, uncertain steps of someone whose body no longer obeyed commands as readily as it once had. Something about the woman caught Sarah's attention despite her focused concentration. Perhaps it was the way she seemed to sway with each movement of the vehicle, or the pale, almost translucent quality of her skin that spoke of illness or exhaustion. The woman wore a threadbare coat that had seen better decades, not just better days, and her fingers, gnarled with age, clutched a small, worn handbag as though it contained all her worldly possessions. Sarah found herself unable to look away, a creeping sense of unease settling into her stomach like a stone. The woman's eyes kept closing, her head dropping forward before jerking back up in that unmistakable rhythm of someone fighting against unconsciousness. Other passengers glanced at her with brief, uncomfortable expressions before quickly returning to their phones, their newspapers, their deliberate obliviousness. Sarah tried to return to her notes, telling herself that someone else would help if help was needed, that she had her own crisis to manage. But her eyes kept drifting back to the elderly woman, and each time, the sense of wrongness intensified. The vehicle stopped again, and the woman struggled to her feet with visible effort, using the metal poles for support as she made her way toward the exit. Sarah watched through the window as the woman stepped onto the pavement, took 2 uncertain steps, and then her legs simply gave out beneath her. It happened almost in slow motion. One moment the woman was upright. The next she was crumpling to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut, her small handbag skittering across the concrete. Sarah's body moved before her mind fully processed what was happening. She was on her feet, her bag forgotten on the seat, her notes scattering to the floor as she pushed past other passengers and stumbled off the vehicle just as its doors were beginning to close. The cold air hit her face as she ran to where the woman lay motionless on the sidewalk, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. Time seemed to split into 2 realities. In one, she was kneeling beside a stranger who desperately needed help. In the other, she was watching her future, her exam, her dreams, begin to slip away with each passing second. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the woman, her hands hovering uncertainly before gently touching the woman's shoulder. The woman's skin felt cold, too cold, even accounting for the morning chill. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps that sent panic shooting through Sarah's veins. "Help!" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with desperation as she looked around the nearly empty street. "Someone help us!" But the few pedestrians hurried past with averted eyes, and the early morning traffic continued its indifferent flow. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She needed to call for emergency services, needed to get help, needed to do something more than just kneel here feeling helpless. She reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling with her pockets, only to realize with a sickening lurch that her phone wasn't there. Her bag. Her phone was in her bag, and her bag was still on the vehicle that was now disappearing around a distant corner, taking with it not just her phone, but her identification, her examination papers, and any proof of who she was or why today mattered so desperately. The woman made a small, pained sound, and Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Sarah's training, all those years of learning to think clearly under pressure, to analyze situations and find solutions, kicked in despite the panic threatening to overwhelm her. She couldn't leave this woman alone on the cold pavement, couldn't just walk away and pretend she hadn't seen someone in desperate need. But she also had no way to call for help, and time was bleeding away with every second that passed. The street remained stubbornly empty, as though the universe itself had decided to test exactly how much she was willing to sacrifice for a complete stranger. Then, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't realized she was saying, Sarah heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Not the public transport, but a private car, its engine purring smoothly as it navigated the morning streets. Without thinking, without considering how insane she must look, Sarah jumped to her feet and ran into the middle of the road, her arms waving frantically above her head, her voice hoarse as she screamed for it to stop. The car's brakes squealed, and for one heart-stopping moment Sarah thought it might not stop in time, that she'd just added getting hit by a car to her rapidly deteriorating morning. The vehicle came to a halt just meters from where she stood, and Sarah could see the driver's face through the windshield, a mixture of shock and anger that quickly transformed into concern as he registered her desperate expression. The window rolled down, revealing a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in what was clearly an expensive suit, his dark hair graying at the temples in that distinguished way that spoke of success and authority. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, but his tone softened immediately when Sarah pointed frantically toward the sidewalk where the elderly woman lay. "Please, I need help. That woman collapsed. She's barely conscious, and I don't have my phone. Please, we need to get her to a hospital right now." The man's eyes followed her pointing finger, and whatever frustration he'd felt at being stopped so abruptly evaporated. He was out of the car in seconds, moving with surprising speed for someone wearing such formal attire, and together they hurried to the woman's side. "How long has she been like this?" the man asked, his voice calm and professional as he knelt beside the elderly woman, his fingers moving to check her pulse with a practiced ease that suggested some medical knowledge. Sarah's words tumbled out in a rush, explaining about the transport vehicle, about seeing the woman collapse, about her missing phone and the impossibility of the timing. The man listened while simultaneously pulling out his own phone, dialing emergency services with one hand while helping Sarah carefully lift the woman with the other. "We can't wait for them to arrive," he said after giving their location to the dispatcher. "There's a medical facility about 8 minutes from here. Help me get her into the car." Together, they managed to ease the woman into the back seat of the man's luxury vehicle, Sarah climbing in beside her to keep her steady while the man took the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and they were moving, the city blurring past the windows as the man navigated through traffic with the skill of someone who knew these streets intimately. Sarah kept one hand on the woman's shoulder, feeling the faint rise and fall of her breathing, whispering reassurances that she wasn't sure the woman could even hear. "You're going to be okay. We're getting you help. Just hold on." The man glanced at them through the rearview mirror, and Sarah caught his eyes for just a moment before he returned his attention to the road. "I'm Thomas," he said, his voice cutting through the tension in the car. "I'm Sarah," she replied automatically, then felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat at the absurdity of exchanging pleasantries while racing to a hospital with an unconscious woman. Thomas seemed to sense her emotional state because he continued talking, his voice steady and grounding. "You did the right thing, stopping me. Most people would have just called and waited, but with someone in her condition, minutes matter." His words should have been comforting, but all Sarah could think about was her examination, the clock ticking away her future with each passing moment. She glanced at her wrist, forgetting that she'd stopped wearing a watch years ago, relying instead on her phone for time. the phone that was currently traveling to who knew where on a public transport vehicle. The medical facility appeared ahead, its modern glass and steel structure gleaming in the morning light like a beacon of hope. Thomas didn't bother with the parking area, driving straight to the emergency entrance where medical staff were already waiting, alerted by his call during the drive. Everything happened in a blur of motion. Uniformed personnel with a wheeled stretcher, urgent voices calling out medical terminology Sarah didn't understand, the elderly woman being lifted carefully from the vehicle and rushed through sliding doors that closed behind them with a soft whoosh of finality. Sarah stood on the pavement, her legs suddenly weak, the adrenaline that had been carrying her beginning to fade and leave behind a trembling exhaustion. Thomas's hand on her shoulder steadied her, guided her toward the entrance. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you inside." As they walked through those doors into the sterile brightness of the medical facility, Sarah felt the full weight of what she'd done begin to settle on her shoulders. She'd missed her examination. After 3 years of perfect attendance, flawless grades, and countless sacrifices, she'd thrown it all away for a stranger whose name she didn't even know. The waiting area of the medical facility was decorated in that deliberately calming way that somehow made everything feel more anxious. With soft blue walls and abstract artwork that was probably meant to be soothing, but only reminded Sarah of how surreal this entire morning had become. She sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, her mind unable to settle on any single thought for more than a few seconds before jumping to another crisis, another consequence of her impulsive decision. Thomas sat beside her, and despite the expensive cut of his suit and the air of authority he carried, he didn't seem impatient or annoyed at having his morning derailed by a stranger's emergency. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made several calls, his voice low and professional as he rearranged what sounded like important meetings, pushing appointments back, delegating responsibilities to people whose names Sarah didn't recognize. She should tell him he could leave, that she'd imposed enough on his kindness already. But the truth was she had no idea what she was going to do next, and his presence felt like the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become quicksand beneath her feet. Finally, Thomas ended his calls and turned to her with an expression that was both kind and assessing, the look of someone who was used to reading people and situations quickly. "So," he said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity. "You mentioned something about an examination when you were explaining why you didn't have your phone." Sarah felt her throat tighten, and to her absolute horror, tears began to well up in her eyes despite her best efforts to maintain some semblance of composure. The words came spilling out then, a confession she hadn't meant to make to a complete stranger but couldn't seem to stop once it started. She told him about the scholarship, about her family who had worked extra shifts and taken second jobs to supplement what the scholarship didn't cover, about the final examination that was probably starting right now, at this very moment, in a lecture hall across the city where her empty seat would be noted and her absence recorded. She told him about the 3 years of perfect grades, about her dreams of working in corporate law, about how one examination stood between her and graduation, and how she'd just watched that opportunity disappear because she couldn't walk past someone who needed help. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression unchanging until she finally ran out of words and sat there feeling exposed and foolish, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand like a child. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity before Thomas spoke, and when he did, his voice carried a weight that made Sarah look up at him in surprise. "What you did this morning, Sarah, stopping to help someone when it cost you something important, that's not weakness. That's character. That's the kind of quality that can't be taught in any classroom or measured by any examination." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Tell me, which institution are you studying at? What program?" Sarah blinked, confused by the question but answering automatically, naming the prestigious university that had been her home for 3 years, explaining about her specialization in corporate law with a focus on international business regulations. She watched as something shifted in Thomas's expression, a flicker of recognition or perhaps understanding that she couldn't quite interpret. Thomas pulled out his phone again, and this time when he made a call, Sarah could hear the authority in his voice ratchet up several notches. "This is Thomas Whitmore," he said, and the name should have meant something to Sarah, but her exhausted brain couldn't make the connection. "I need to speak with Dean Richardson." Yes, I know what time it is. This is urgent. Sarah sat frozen, afraid to move or speak as she watched this play out. Thomas stood and walked a few paces away, his voice dropping lower so she could only catch fragments of the conversation. She heard her name mentioned, heard words like exceptional circumstances and medical emergency and character assessment. The call seemed to go on forever, and Sarah's heart was beating so hard she thought it might actually break through her ribcage. When Thomas finally returned and sat down beside her, his expression was carefully neutral. The examination board will see you tomorrow morning, he said simply. You'll take an alternative version of the same test, equivalent difficulty, but different questions to maintain academic integrity. If you pass, you graduate with your class. If not, well, you'll have to retake it in the summer term. Sarah stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he'd just said, unable to believe that a single phone call could undo what she'd thought was an irrevocable disaster. How did you? She started, but Thomas held up a hand, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Let's just say that my company has certain relationships with educational institutions in the area. We recruit heavily from your university's law program, and over the years I've gotten to know the administration fairly well. When I explained what happened, what you sacrificed to help someone in need, Dean Richardson was actually quite moved. Apparently, they've been discussing adding character assessments to their evaluation criteria, and this seemed like a perfect real-world example. Sarah felt like she was dreaming, like at any moment she'd wake up still sitting on that transport vehicle with her notes in her lap, and none of this surreal morning would have actually happened. But Thomas continued talking, explaining that he'd need her to call her family, that the university would need to verify her story, that tomorrow she'd need to arrive prepared and ready to prove she deserved this second chance. Sarah realized she was crying again, but this time from relief so profound it was almost painful. Thomas handed her his phone without hesitation, and Sarah's fingers trembled as she dialed the number she'd known by heart since childhood, the number that connected her to the small apartment where her parents would be getting ready for their respective shifts, probably worrying about how her examination was going. Her mother answered on the second ring, her voice already tight with that particular brand of parental anxiety that came from knowing something important was happening in your child's life and being unable to control it. Hello. The word came out cautious, uncertain, probably because she didn't recognize the number on her display. Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. Mom, it's me. I'm okay, but something happened. The next few minutes were a blur of explanation and reassurance as Sarah recounted the morning's events, her mother's sharp intakes of breath punctuating the story at all the critical moments. When Sarah got to the part about Thomas and the rearranged examination, her mother went completely silent for so long that Sarah thought the connection had dropped. Then she heard her father's voice in the background, demanding to know what was wrong, and her mother's tearful explanation as she relayed the story to him. Her father took the phone, his voice gruff with emotion that he was clearly trying to control. Sarah, baby, you did the right thing. You always do the right thing, even when it costs you. His words broke something loose inside her chest, and she had to bite her lip hard to keep from sobbing. But Dad, I almost ruined everything. If Thomas hadn't been able to help, I would have lost my chance at graduating, all because I couldn't just walk away and let someone else handle it. Her father made a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely. That's exactly who we raised you to be, sweetheart. Your mother and I, we didn't sacrifice so you could learn to turn away when people need help. We sacrificed so you could be the kind of person who stops. The universe has a way of taking care of people like that, even when it seems impossible. They talked for a few more minutes, her parents extracting promises that she'd call them immediately after the examination tomorrow, that she'd take care of herself today, that she'd thank Thomas properly for his extraordinary kindness. When she finally hung up and handed the phone back to Thomas, she felt simultaneously drained and energized, as though the conversation had somehow reset her emotional equilibrium. A doctor emerged from the treatment area, clipboard in hand, and an expression that Sarah had learned to read during her own brief hospitalizations over the years, the look that said the news was good but complicated. Thomas stood immediately, and Sarah followed his lead, both of them moving toward the doctor with synchronized concern. The patient is stable, the doctor began, and Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. She was severely dehydrated and malnourished, and she's suffering from hypothermia from extended exposure to cold temperatures. She also has an untreated respiratory infection that's been developing for probably several weeks. The doctor's expression softened as he looked at Sarah. You very likely saved her life. Another few hours, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, the magnitude of what could have happened hitting her like a physical blow. The doctor continued, explaining that they were admitting the woman for observation and treatment, that she'd need several days of care before she could be released, and that social services had been contacted to ensure she had somewhere safe to go afterward. Thomas asked several pointed questions about the woman's condition, about the treatment plan, about costs and insurance, questions that Sarah's exhausted brain hadn't even begun to formulate. The doctor answered each one professionally, and then Thomas did something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Whatever her medical expenses are, send the bills to my office. And make sure she has everything she needs, private room, whatever will make her comfortable. The doctor nodded as though this was a perfectly normal request, took a business card that Thomas produced from his wallet, and disappeared back through the doors to the treatment area. Sarah turned to Thomas, struggling to find words adequate to express what she was feeling. You don't have to do that. You've already done so much, calling the university, staying here with me. You don't even know her name. Thomas's expression was unreadable for a moment, and then he said something that made all the pieces suddenly click into place in Sarah's mind. The company I run, we handle corporate law and business litigation. Whitmore and Associates. Maybe you've heard of it. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet for what seemed like the 100th time that morning. Whitmore and Associates wasn't just any firm. It was the firm, the one that every law student in the program dreamed of joining. The one with the legendary reputation for taking on impossible cases and winning. The one that paid starting salaries that made other firms' offers look like charity. It was the firm where Sarah had submitted her application 6 months ago, along with probably 300 other hopeful graduates, knowing her chances of even getting an interview were microscopically small. And she'd just spent the last hour falling apart in front of its founder and senior partner, showing him every vulnerable, unprofessional moment of her complete emotional breakdown. Thomas was watching her face, and she saw the exact moment he realized she'd made the connection, saw the small smile that suggested he'd been waiting for precisely this reaction. Every year, we get hundreds of applications from brilliant students with perfect grades and impeccable references. And every year, we hire maybe 5 or 6 of them. Do you know what we're really looking for, Sarah? Not just someone who can memorize case law or write flawless briefs. We're looking for people who, when faced with an impossible choice, make the hard decision. The right decision, even when it costs them everything. Sarah couldn't find her voice, couldn't form coherent thoughts beyond the surreal realization that the man who had just reorganized her entire future was the same man whose firm represented everything she'd been working toward for 3 years. Thomas seemed to understand her shock because he didn't press for a response, instead gesturing toward the exit and suggesting they get some fresh air while they waited for updates on the elderly woman's condition. Outside, the morning had fully arrived, the early chill burning off under a sky that was transitioning from gray to pale blue, and Sarah found herself walking alongside Thomas through the medical facility's landscaped grounds, her mind racing through implications and possibilities she couldn't quite grasp. Thomas spoke first, his voice taking on a different quality now, less the good Samaritan who'd stopped to help and more the seasoned attorney who'd built an empire on reading people and situations. I'm going to tell you something that stays between us for now, he said, and there was a seriousness in his tone that made Sarah pay attention despite her mental exhaustion. That elderly woman you helped, we've identified her from the documents in her handbag. Her name is Margaret Chun, and until about 18 months ago, she was one of the most successful real estate developers in the region. Sarah stopped walking, turning to stare at Thomas in disbelief. What happened to her? Thomas's expression darkened with something that looked like anger, but not directed at Sarah. Family dispute over her estate while she was still alive. Her children, grown adults who should have known better, decided they wanted control of her assets. They had her declared incompetent, took over her finances, and systematically isolated her from everyone who might have helped. By the time the courts realized what was happening and reversed the decision, she'd lost almost everything. Her health had deteriorated from the stress and neglect, and she was too proud to ask for help from the few friends who remained. The story hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. The casual cruelty of it. The way someone who'd built an entire career could be reduced to collapsing on sidewalks while strangers walked past. Thomas continued, his voice tight with controlled fury. My firm actually represented her in the legal battle to regain her autonomy. We won, but the damage was done. She disappeared after the case concluded, and despite our efforts to locate her and offer continued assistance, she vanished into the streets. Until this morning, when you decided her life was worth being late for. They resumed walking, and Sarah processed this new information, understanding now why Thomas had been so quick to cover the medical expenses, why he'd stayed when he clearly had a schedule packed with important obligations. This wasn't just random kindness. It was personal. It was unfinished business. It was the universe providing a second chance to help someone who'd slipped through the cracks the first time. She'll be taken care of now, Thomas said. And it wasn't a question but a statement of fact, the kind of declaration that Sarah was beginning to understand meant resources would be mobilized, systems would be activated, and whatever needed to happen would happen because Thomas Whitmore had decided it would. But that's not why I'm telling you this story. I'm telling you because what you did this morning, stopping for someone everyone else ignored, that's exactly the kind of instinct we need in our firm. Not just the legal brilliance, though obviously that's essential, but the human element, the ability to see people not as case files, but as individuals who deserve dignity and justice. Sarah felt like she was standing at a crossroads, one of those moments that would define the trajectory of everything that came after, and she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for what Thomas seemed to be offering. He pulled another business card from his wallet, this one different from the one he'd given the doctor, and handed it to her. This has my direct line. After you take your examination tomorrow, and after you've had some time to process everything that happened today, I want you to call me. We have an internship program for exceptional graduates, and I think you'd be an excellent fit. No promises, you'd still have to interview with the partners and prove you can handle the work, but I can guarantee you'll get that opportunity. Sarah took the card, her fingers closing around it like a lifeline, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally managed to speak. I don't know what to say. This whole morning feels like something that couldn't possibly be real. Thomas smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his professional demeanor into something warmer, more human. Get used to that feeling. The law is full of moments that seem impossible until they happen. They returned to the waiting area, and Thomas made arrangements for Sarah to retrieve her belongings from the transit system's lost and found, pulling strings she didn't know existed to have someone actually locate and hold her bag at a central depot rather than making her wait days or weeks for the bureaucracy to process it. He insisted on driving her there personally, and during the ride, they talked about her studies, about the cases she'd found most interesting, about her thesis on international trade regulations and digital commerce. Thomas listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed the depth of his own expertise, and Sarah found herself relaxing into the conversation, her earlier nervousness fading as she realized he was treating her not as a charity case or a curiosity, but as a colleague, someone whose opinions and insights had value. At the depot, her bag was waiting exactly as Thomas had arranged, everything inside exactly as she'd left it, her phone dead but otherwise undamaged, her notes somehow still in order despite their earlier scattering. She clutched it to her chest like a talisman, this physical proof that the morning's chaos hadn't destroyed everything. Thomas drove Sarah back to her university residence, the familiar buildings appearing through the car windows like old friends she'd been separated from for years rather than hours, though in a sense, she had been gone for far longer than the clock suggested. Everything looked the same, students hurrying between classes, the ancient trees that lined the pathways, the stone architecture that spoke of tradition and permanence. But Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had changed in some fundamental way that couldn't be measured or quantified. When Thomas pulled up to the entrance of her building, he turned to her with an expression that contained both seriousness and something that might have been pride. Tomorrow morning, you're going to walk into that examination room, and you're going to show them exactly why you deserve to be there. Not because of what happened today, not because I made a phone call, but because you've earned it through 3 years of hard work and dedication. What happened this morning just gave you the chance to prove it. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of that truth settle into her bones, understanding that the second chance she'd been given came with its own burden of expectation and responsibility. She spent the rest of that day in her small residence room, reviewing her notes with a focus born of desperation and determination. But her mind kept drifting back to the morning's events, to Margaret Chun lying in that hospital bed, to Thomas Whitmore's unexpected kindness, to the strange series of coincidences that felt less like random chance and more like the universe's peculiar sense of justice. That evening, she received a text from an unknown number with an update on Margaret's condition, stable and improving, expected to make a full recovery, already asking the nurses about the young woman who'd stopped to help her. Sarah read the message 3 times, feeling something tight in her chest finally begin to loosen, the guilt and worry she hadn't fully acknowledged suddenly lifting like fog under morning sun. She tried to sleep, but her mind refused to settle, running through legal theories and case precedents, through the morning's chaos and the afternoon's revelations, through fears about tomorrow and hopes for what might come after. When her alarm sounded at dawn, she felt like she'd barely closed her eyes, but the adrenaline that flooded her system the moment she remembered what day it was banished any lingering exhaustion. The examination room was smaller than the main hall where her classmates had taken their test the previous day, just her and 2 proctors and a desk positioned in the center like an island in an ocean of empty space. The alternative examination sat before her, sealed in its official envelope, and when the proctor gave her permission to begin, Sarah's hands were steady as she broke the seal and revealed the questions that would determine her future. The test was everything Thomas had promised, equivalent in difficulty to what she'd prepared for, but different enough that she couldn't rely solely on memorized answers, requiring instead the kind of analytical thinking and creative problem-solving that separated truly exceptional students from those who merely excelled at retention. Sarah lost herself in the work, her pen moving across page after page, building arguments and citing precedents, demonstrating not just knowledge but understanding, not just intelligence but wisdom. 3 hours passed in what felt like minutes, and when she finally set down her pen and looked up at the clock, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, the certainty that regardless of the outcome, she had given everything she had to give. The results came faster than she'd expected, just 2 days of agonizing waiting before she received the official notification that she'd not only passed, but had scored in the top percentile, her performance earning commendations from the examination board and a personal note from Dean Richardson praising her composure under extraordinary circumstances. Graduation followed in a blur of ceremony and celebration, her parents weeping proudly in the audience, while Sarah crossed the stage to receive her degree, the weight of the diploma in her hands representing so much more than just 3 years of study. That evening, still wearing her graduation gown because she couldn't quite bring herself to take it off yet, Sarah made the call she'd been both anticipating and dreading since Thomas had given her his card. His assistant answered, professional and courteous, and when Sarah gave her name, there was only the briefest pause before she was transferred directly to Thomas's line. His voice was warm, congratulatory, and when he invited her to come to the firm the following week for a formal interview, she heard something in his tone that suggested the outcome was already decided, that this was merely a formality required by professional protocol. The internship turned into a permanent position, Sarah's natural talent and tireless work ethic earning her a reputation within the firm that had nothing to do with how she'd first met Thomas Whitmore and everything to do with the lawyer she proved herself to be. She handled cases that challenged her, worked alongside partners who demanded excellence, and gradually built a career that exceeded even her most ambitious dreams. But perhaps more importantly, she maintained a relationship with Margaret Chun, who with Thomas's firm's assistance had rebuilt her life with a quietness and dignity that spoke to her remarkable resilience. They met for coffee once a month, these 2 women whose lives had intersected on a cold morning when one had chosen compassion over convenience. And in those conversations, Sarah found a mentor and friend whose wisdom about life extended far beyond anything taught in classrooms or courtrooms. Years later, when Sarah made partner at Whitmore & Associates, the youngest in the firm's history to achieve that distinction, she stood in Thomas's office looking out over the city and remembered that morning when she'd thought she was losing everything. Thomas, now grayer but no less formidable, stood beside her and said what they'd both been thinking. Funny how the moments that feel like endings are sometimes actually beginnings, isn't it? Sarah smiled, thinking of Margaret, of second chances, of the unpredictable architecture of fate, and of how a single choice made in desperation and compassion had somehow led her exactly where she was always meant to be. The elderly woman she'd stopped to help that morning had given her far more than Sarah had given in return, had taught her that success measured only in personal achievement was hollow compared to success that included the courage to care about strangers, to sacrifice for principles, to believe that doing the right thing mattered even when it cost everything. And in the end, that lesson had proven more valuable than any degree, any partnership, any victory in any courtroom could ever be.